Hey everyone, and welcome! Today, we're going to look at some of the most common challenges in the classroom. Things like language barriers and, when students get things wrong. But we're going to look at them through a totally new lens. What if they aren't problems at all? What if they're actually clues that show us exactly how the student brain is working? Let's kick things off with a big question.
So, picture this. You walk into a classroom and your students speak 20 different languages. 20! Now, is that just chaos? Is that a massive hurdle you have to overcome just to get started? Or could it actually be one of the most powerful learning tools you have at your disposal?
You see, for the longest time, that kind of diversity was seen as a problem that needed to be solved or managed. But there's been a huge shift in how we think about this, a shift that asks us to completely flip that old idea on its head. Let's dig into how we do that.
And wow, the difference in thinking is just night and day, isn't it? The old way of thinking saw all those extra languages as interference, something that just got in the way of learning English, for example. But the new view, which is championed by big educational frameworks like India's National Curriculum Framework, sees it completely differently. It's not a hurdle, it's a resource, it's an asset. It becomes a strategy for teaching and, maybe most importantly, it tells the student, your identity, where you come from, is welcome here.
So, how does that actually work in a real classroom? Well, it's actually pretty simple and kind of brilliant. Instead of telling a kid, nope, only English in this classroom, you use their home language as a bridge. So you could hold up a glass and say, in English, we call this water. What do you call it in your language? And a student from Bengal might say, Joel. Perfect. You've just built a bridge from something they know to something new. You're building confidence, not fear.
And this idea is so powerful that it's actually been built into national policy. The Kothari Commission in India came up with this three-language formula. The whole point is to structure language learning in a way that makes sense. You start with your mother tongue to build a really strong foundation, then you add a second language, like Hindi or English, and then a third. It's a smart, structured way to embrace all that linguistic diversity instead of trying to erase it.
Okay, so let's shift gears a bit. We've talked about the classroom environment. Now let's zoom right into a student's mind. The next huge mindset shift has to do with how we see wrong answers. Because the key isn't focusing on what a student gets wrong, it's all about figuring out why.
And this is a super important distinction. You see, not all wrong answers are created equal. A mistake is just a slip-up. Maybe the student is tired or a little anxious. If you point it out, they can usually fix it themselves. But an error, that's different. An error points to a real, systematic gap in their understanding. The student genuinely thinks their answer's right. And that's a huge clue for a teacher that, okay, this topic needs to be taught again, probably in a totally new way.
This is probably one of my favorite ideas. Ever. Errors are windows to the brain. Just think about that for a second. They're not failures. They're not something to be embarrassed about. They are literally a window that lets us peek inside a child's head and see their thought process. They show us how they're trying to make sense of the world. They're not mistakes. They're data.
In fact, you could argue that errors are an absolutely essential part of learning. I mean, think about a little kid who says, I good to the store instead of I went. That's not a random mistake. That's actually evidence that their brain has figured out the rule for making something past tense. You add ed, and now it's just applying that rule everywhere. They're thinking like a scientist, testing a theory. That shows that real deep learning is actually happening.
Okay, but what about when the errors a student is making are really consistent and seem to point to a more specific kind of challenge? Well, that's when we move from looking at general learning errors to identifying specific learning disorders. And here's a really cool tip. The names of these disorders can sound really complex and intimidating, right? But they often contain clues to what they mean. A lot of them come from Greek roots that tell you exactly what area of learning is being affected. So let's just break this down. Look at dyslexia. The root lex means word. Simple, right? So it's a difficulty with words or reading. For dysgraphia, graph means to write, so it's a challenge with writing. And calc, as in calculator, means to count, so dyscalculia is about math. Understanding this helps us realize that these aren't signs of a child not being smart. They're just very specific challenges with how the brain is processing certain kinds of information. So once we've used all these incredible clues, from a student's language to their errors to maybe a specific disorder, to really understand their learning gap, what's next? What do we do about it? Well, the solution is a really clear two-step process called remediation. It's really just a logical path forward. First, you play detective. You use tests and observations to diagnose the problem, to find the exact source of the difficulty. You've got to know precisely what the gap is. Then, and only then, do you move to step 2, remedial teaching. And this is so important. This doesn't mean just repeating the same lesson, but louder. It means you reteach the concept using a completely different strategy, one that's tailored to that specific student. And I really want to land this point because it's a game changer. Remedial teaching is not a label for slow learners. It is simply targeted support. Any student, no matter how bright, might run into a specific difficulty with a particular topic. Remediation is just the process of identifying that hurdle and giving them the tools to get over it. That's it. So let's pull all of this together. The new mindset, the really effective way to think about teaching, is all about shifting your perspective. Multilingualism isn't interference, it's a resource. Student errors aren't failures, they are windows into the brain. Learning disorders aren't dead ends, they are identifiable challenges we can work with. And our goal isn't just repeating information, it's about strategically filling the gaps. And that leaves us with one last thing to think about. This whole approach, being empathetic, being a detective, it's incredibly powerful in a classroom. But what if we applied it to ourselves? What if we started seeing our own mistakes not as failures, but as valuable data that's just pointing out where our gaps are? How would that change the way we learn and grow, and maybe even how we treat ourselves? Something to think about.